Have you ever wanted something so badly that you literally just refused to sleep?
Like staying up all night.
Yeah, but I don't mean insomnia, where you're just staring at the ceiling wishing you could drift off. And I don't mean, pulling an all-nighter for a paper
Mhm.
because you procrastinated to the last minute.
Right, right. Because that's panic, not desire.
Exactly. I'm talking about a singular driving obsession where you basically tell yourself, I am not going to bed, I am not going home, I am just not stopping until this specific mission is accomplished.
Wow, yeah.
It's that feeling where resting actually feels like a betrayal of your goal.
That is a level of intensity that honestly most of us would probably classify as unhealthy today. I mean, we usually see that in tech founders during a launch week or maybe in those sports movies where the athlete is training in the rain at 3 in the morning.
Right, the montage scene.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly rare to see that kind of gritty obsession directed towards something spiritual.
It really is. But that is actually the hook for today's deep dive. We are looking at a text that is entirely fueled by that specific kind of refusal to rest. We're unpacking Psalm 132 today.
Which is such a fascinating choice for a deep dive because it's so often overlooked. It's one of the longest of the songs of degrees, or songs of ascents, as they're sometimes called.
The Pilgrim Song.
Yeah, these were basically the playlists of ancient pilgrims. You have to picture thousands of people literally walking uphill, hiking the elevation toward Jerusalem for a festival, and singing these lyrics to set their minds right before they arrived.
So it's basically road trip music, but with incredibly high stakes.
Very high stakes. And heavy history, too. It's definitely not a lighthearted sing-along.
No, not at all. And our mission today is to see how this ancient song functions as a modern blueprint for us.
Yeah.
So we've got the text itself, plus a theological application guide that pulls out the wisdom on things like prioritization and legacy.
And we're going to look at a very specific exchange here.
Right. It starts with a human vow, a gritty, sleepless promise, and it ends with a divine oath that outlasts the person who even made it.
It's essentially a dialogue between a restless king and a faithful God. And the sources we have argue that this isn't just history, it's a practical framework for finding stability. Like, if you're trying to figure out how to strengthen your trust in God when the world feels incredibly shaky, this text is basically a masterclass in exactly that.
So let's just get right into the narrative.
Yeah.
Part 1 covers the first 10 verses, and it centers on David. But like you said, this isn't the gentle, heart-playing shepherd vibe.
No.
This is David in a state of serious agitation.
Agitation is definitely the right word. I mean, the text opens with a plea, Lord, remember David and all his afflictions. Now, that word afflictions in the original context, it implies rigorous hardship. It's not just that he had a bad day at the office.
Right.
It's that he was burdening himself with a massive task. He was carrying a huge weight.
And the text immediately pivots to the vow he makes to the mighty God of Jacob. I actually want to read verses 3 through 5 because the imagery is just so stark. He says, Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes, or slumber to mine eyelids.
Let's pause there for a second because we skim over that since we're so used to biblical language. But think about the cultural weight of what he's saying.
It's heavy.
Very. In the ancient Near East, your house and your bed are the ultimate symbols of security, status, and rest. So a king forfeiting his bed isn't just about him being tired. He is voluntarily rejecting the comforts of his station.
He's basically saying, I don't deserve to be comfortable yet.
Exactly. He's essentially saying, I cannot enjoy my personal success while my spiritual priority remains unresolved. It's a total self-imposed embargo on luxury.
And that priority is defined in verse 5. He says, Until I find out a place for the Lord, a habitation for the mighty God of Jacob. Now, for the listener who might not be a biblical scholar, why does God need a habitation? Because God is everywhere.
Right. Theology tells us God is omnipresent. But David is talking specifically about the Ark of the Covenant here.
Okay.
For generations, the Ark, which represented the tangible, localized presence of God, had been totally mobile. It was intense. It was moved around. It got captured. It was returned. It was essentially spiritually homeless.
So David is trying to move from a mindset of nomadic faith to one of permanence.
Yes. He's looking at his own palace, which is made of expensive cedar, and then looking at the ark, which is just sitting in a tent, and that discrepancy is eating him alive. He wants to center the nation around the presence of God, physically and geographically. He wants to give God a permanent address.
And the text describes the search for this object almost like an ancient archaeological thriller. Verse 6 says, Lo, we heard of it at Ephrata, we found it in the fields of the wood.
That phrase, fields of the wood, is likely a reference to Kirjath-Jearim, which was a town out on the outskirts. It implies total obscurity. The Ark had been sitting there for 20 years, largely neglected. Yeah, it wasn't in the capital city, it wasn't headline news, it was literally left in the margins.
That's a key insight from the guide we're looking at. David's zeal is all about taking what was on the margins and dragging it back to the absolute center.
And that takes immense effort. That's why he can't sleep. He's realized that if he doesn't do it, nobody else is going to. The status quo was perfectly comfortable with God being on the outskirts. But David wasn't.
What happens next in the text is a shift that I think is just crucial for leadership. It moves from I to we. Verse 7 says, "We will go into his tabernacles, we will worship at his footstool."
That's the contagion of zeal right there. Passion is infectious. Because David was obsessed, the community eventually caught the vision too. They stopped seeing the ark as just some old relic out in the woods and started seeing it as the place to worship.
One person's sleeplessness woke everyone else up.
That's a great way to put it.
And then they launch into this corporate prayer in verse 9. "Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy saints shout for joy."
Which is a pretty standard liturgical request.
Yeah.
They want the religious leaders to have integrity clothed in righteousness, and they want the people to be happy. It's a good, safe prayer.
Keep that in mind, listener, because the source material points out something absolutely brilliant about how God answers that specific prayer later on. But before we get to the answer, we have to talk about the turn.
The turn.
And the pivot point of the whole psalm. We've had 10 verses of the human vow. I will not sleep, we will go, let us worship. It's all human effort, it's the grind.
Right, it's the striving phase.
But verse 11 completely changes the speaker. And this leads us to part 2, which is the divine promise.
This is where the deep dive gets really interesting structurally. The psalm acts like a mirror. In verse 2, David swears an oath to the Lord. And then in verse 11, the Lord swears an oath to David.
It's totally reciprocal.
It is, but importantly, it's not equal. And that's the beauty of it. David offers his limited, human, sleepless devotion. And God responds with an eternal, unshakable covenant.
Let's break down what God actually promises here, because it's so much bigger than just finding the ark. Verses 11 and 12 say, "Of the fruit of thy body will I set upon thy throne."
This is the famous Davidic covenant. David wanted to build God a house, meaning a physical temple. And God replies essentially, no, I'm going to build you a house, but he doesn't mean a building. He means a lineage, a dynasty.
So it's a massive legacy play.
It's the ultimate legacy play. God promises that if David's descendants align themselves with this truth, their authority will be established forever. David was worried about the immediate logistical problem of where the ark goes. God answers with a sweeping generational solution of who will sit on the throne forever.
And then God actually addresses the location. Verse 13 says, "For the Lord hath chosen Zion, he hath desired it for his habitation." And then verse 14, and this line always gives me chills, "This is my rest forever, here will I dwell, for I have desired it."
The irony there is so profound. Remember verse 4. David said, I will not rest. And now God says, this is my rest.
David's restlessness literally created the conditions for God's rest.
Precisely. And when God speaks of rest here, we have to remember, he doesn't mean taking a nap because he's tired. In the ancient world, a deity resting meant they were taking their seat of authority. They were sovereign. The war is over, the order is established, and the king is on the throne. God is saying, I'm not just visiting Jerusalem, I'm moving in.
That distinction, visiting versus dwelling, seems central to this entire text.
It really is. We so often treat spirituality as a visitation. We visit a church, we visit a moment of prayer before a meal, but God is interested in habitation. He wants a permanent address in the center of the life of the nation, or in our case today, the life of the believer.
Now I want to jump back to that prayer we pinned earlier. The people asked for two things: priests clothed in righteousness and saints shouting for joy.
Right, the safe prayer.
Exactly. But look at God's specific reply in verse 16. He says, "I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy."
I love this detail so much. The source material calls this the divine upgrade.
The upgrade. I like that.
Look at the difference. The people ask for righteousness, which is really just about moral standing. It's good, sure, but God gives salvation. That word in Hebrew implies full deliverance, victory, wholeness, safety. It's a massively bigger concept than just having moral rectitude.
And what about the joy part?
They asked to simply shout for joy. God says they will shout aloud. In Hebrew text, it's an emphatic repetition. It's like saying they will shout, shouting. It implies this uncontainable, completely exuberant joy.
So the core principle here is that God's answer is always more robust than the human request.
Exactly. We ask for the bare minimum we think we need to get by, and God answers according to his own abundance. We bring our little loaf of bread devotion, and he turns it into a massive feast. And actually, speaking of bread, verse 16 covers that too. It says, I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread.
So the promise isn't just spiritual pie in the sky. It's deeply economic.
It's holistic. If God is in the center, if that habitation is actually established, it flows out into the economy, into the social safety net by satisfying the poor, into the emotional state of the people. It literally touches everything.
Now, there are two metaphors at the end of the text that can be a bit dense for modern ears. Verse 17 says, There will I make the horn of David to bud. I have ordained a lamp for mine anointed.
Yeah, I know that sounds like gardening and interior design, but it's actually hardcore political language.
Break that down for us.
Okay, so the horn in biblical literature is a symbol of strength, fighting power, and authority. Think of a bull or a ram. If your horn is budding or growing, it means your power is fresh. It's constantly renewing. It's not brittle or old. So God is saying David's strength will constantly regenerate.
And the lamp.
The lamp is all about continuity and guidance. In ancient times, if the lamp went out in a house, it meant the family line had ended. The house was abandoned, it was over. So promising a lamp for the anointed means that David's line will never stumble in the dark. There will always be a light on in the house of David.
Which, for a Christian reading this text today, echoes all the way forward to the Messiah.
100%. It's the ultimate promise of an eternal king who provides eternal light.
So we have this beautiful symmetrical poem. David's vow of sleeplessness meets God's promise of rest. David's desire for a house for God meets God's promise of a house for David. It's poetic, it's theological, it's grand, but we are not ancient Near Eastern kings.
Speak for yourself.
Fair enough. But seriously, we aren't looking for a golden box to carry up a mountain. And most of us definitely aren't sleeplessly obsessed with building a literal stone temple.
That is a very fair point.
So how does this actually land for the person listening to this deep dive right now? Someone who has a job, maybe has kids, a mortgage, and is just trying to get through the chaos of the week. How do we apply Psalm 132 to strengthen our actual real-world trust and relationship with God?
The application guide included with our sources is incredibly helpful here because it shifts us from the literal historical events to the structural principles. And the first major point it makes is about prioritizing what matters.
Which circles right back to the sleeplessness.
It does. We live in a modern culture that basically worships two things, productivity and comfort. And David challenges both of those directly. He was highly productive, yes, but he utterly refused comfort until his priorities were ordered correctly.
The source actually has a great quote here. It says, if faith and purpose are secondary, the structure of your life will reflect that.
That's the real arch moment, isn't it? Look at your calendar. Look at your bank statement.
Yeah.
If you claim that your trust in God or even just your core values are the center,
Right.
but they only ever get the leftover time, the time when you're too tired to do anything else, then you haven't built a habitation at all. You're still treating it like a mobile tent in the woods.
So the real challenge is to build your life around what deserves permanence.
Right. Think about it. Most of what we stress about, what we literally lose sleep over today, is entirely temporary. A stressful project at work, a kitchen renovation, some social media spat. David lost sleep over the one thing that would actually last. It's a great filter to ask yourself, does this thing I'm worrying about right now even deserve this level of anxiety?
That perfectly sets up the second application, which I honestly think is the most practical one for our audience today. Sacred space versus intentional habits.
This is where we have to translate the concept of temple into time.
Explain how that works.
Well, we aren't out there building a stone temple, but we are all architects of our own schedules. The source argues that the modern equivalent of finding a place for the ark is carving out a totally non-negotiable space in your day for the sacred.
But is that even realistic? I mean, life is
Yeah.
just chaotic.
That's exactly why it requires that Davidic intensity. If you just wait around for spiritual time to organically happen, it never will. The fields of the wood are full of good intentions. David had to proactively go find the ark and drum it up the mountain. You have to hunt down that time in your schedule and fiercely defend it.
The guide says, spiritual growth is not accidental.
Never. It's architectural. You have to build the daily structure that holds it. If you don't have a specific time for reflection, for prayer, for gratitude, your devotion will inevitably fade into distraction. That's just baseline human nature. And honestly, this is exactly where trust is built.
How so?
Well, trust is built in the quiet moments. You can't deeply trust someone you never actually speak to or listen to. If you want to strengthen your relationship with God, you have to create the habitation in your day where that relationship actually
I
happens.
really like the third application point because it takes some of the pressure off the individual and spreads it out. It's about thinking generationally.
This connects directly back to the fruit of the body promise we talked about earlier. David's intense devotion wasn't just for his own benefit. It secured the throne and the stability for his children.
This is huge for any parents or mentors listening right now.
It really is. The source puts it perfectly. Today's devotion shapes tomorrow's legacy. When you make the hard choice to choose integrity, or when you choose to prioritize the sacred in your home, you aren't just improving your own life, you are literally building a floor for the people coming up after you to stand on.
I think that's such a powerful reframing. Sometimes focusing on self-improvement or personal spiritual growth feels almost selfish. But this suggests that your personal stability becomes their starting point.
Exactly. If you are chaotic and spiritually homeless, your kids or your team at work or your mentees, they inherit that exact chaos. But if you do the hard work of finding rest in God, they inherit a solid foundation. I mean, David's hard work is what allowed Solomon to eventually build the temple in total peace.
And speaking of peace, the fourth application is stability.
This is the ultimate anchor. We talked about how God said, "This is my rest forever."
In a world of 24/7 news cycles, volatile stock markets, and constant political polarization, forever sounds pretty nice right about now.
It sounds totally necessary. If your internal peace is tied to the economy, you're going to be constantly anxious. If it's tied to who is sitting in the White House, you're going to be anxious. The psalm makes the argument that true, unshakable stability only comes from alignment with the eternal.
It's the difference between tying your boat to another drifting boat versus dropping an anchor all the way to the seabed.
Right. Zion represents the thing that absolutely cannot be moved. So the application here is to check your anchors. What are you actually trusting in for your safety on a daily basis? If you want to deepen your trust in God, you have to stop trying to anchor your soul to things that are constantly moving.
That brings us to the fifth and final application, reframing ambition.
This is so important because religious people are sometimes subtly told to just be passive, let go and let God. But David was not passive in this text at all. He was incredibly ambitious.
He swore a massive oath. He rallied the entire country. He organized a huge logistical operation to move a national artifact.
He was a serious mover and shaker. But, and this is the crucial key, his ambition was entirely God-centered, not self-exalting. He wasn't trying to build a shiny new monument to David. He was trying to build a place for God.
The modern takeaway here is to aim for impact that honors something greater than yourself.
It completely changes the energy of your daily work. If you're building a business, are you just doing it to feed your own ego or to create actual value and serve people? If you're raising a family, is it just so they look perfect on a holiday card or so they actually become people of deep character?
As the guide says, what you build for God builds you in return.
That's that beautiful reciprocal nature of the psalm coming right back around to us.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole picture of this deep dive. We've traversed from the dusty roads of ancient Israel all the way to the frantic, overflowing schedules of the 21st century.
We've seen a king who refused to sleep until he put God right back in the center. And we've seen a God who responded with overwhelming promises of presence, provision, and lasting power.
And the takeaway isn't that we need to literally stop sleeping.
No, please sleep. We definitely need you rested.
The takeaway is that we need to stop drifting. We need to actively decide what matters most and build a rigid structure that protects it.
It's a deliberate move from spiritual homelessness to a permanent habitation.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've talked a lot about finding a physical place or making time in our schedules. But what if the modern fields of the wood, that place of obscurity where the sacred gets forgotten, is actually our own distracted minds?
Oh, that's interesting.
What if our modern anxiety and our literal sleeplessness is actually just a symptom of our own spiritual homelessness? We can't rest at night because we haven't secured that permanent habitation inside ourselves yet.
That completely flips it. We aren't building the temple outside anymore. We are the habitation.
Exactly. So here is the question we want to leave you with today. Look at the house of your life right now, your time, your energy, your financial resources.
And ask yourself, How will you apply this information in your life? Are you just building for temporary comfort, or are you building for a lasting legacy?
Are you prioritizing the easy thing or the eternal thing? Because as Psalm 132 so clearly shows us, you really can't have the promise without making the vow.
That is the hard, beautiful reality.
If you enjoyed this deep dive and you want to actually look at the notes, see the breakdown of those Hebrew words we mentioned, or get the application guide to help you build that intentional schedule, we'd love for you to join our community. You can support the show and get all those resources by joining the mailing list at bit.ly practical advice.
We really appreciate you listening. It's always a privilege to unpack these texts with you.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.